Ever had a boss so arrogant, he thought he could crush you just because he wore a suit and had a corner office? Well, my boss thought I was just another replaceable cog in his machine. But I stayed silent, patient, and watched him dig his own grave. This isn't just a workplace story. This is how arrogance destroys itself, and how I walked away with everything while my boss's empire came crashing down. I still remember the first day I walked into Sterling & Company, one of the most prestigious corporate consulting firms in the city. Everything about the place screamed wealth and power. The marble floors were polished so perfectly you could see your reflection. The walls were glass, clear enough to reveal every corner of the sprawling office, but also intimidating. Like the company had nothing to hide, yet everything to prove. Even the air smelled expensive, laced with cologne that probably cost more than my monthly rent. And at the center of it all was him. Edward Sterling Jr., son of the CEO, heir to the empire, and self-proclaimed genius of the corporate world. He didn't just walk into a room. He occupied it. His tailored suits, his smug smile, his booming voice. It was all designed to remind us that he was the boss, not because of talent, but because of his last name. I was fresh in the company, just another analyst among dozens. My job to crunch numbers and stay invisible. But Edward? He noticed me on day one. Not for my potential, not for my ideas, but for my silence. To him, quiet meant weak. To me, silence was strategy. From that moment, I became his target. He piled impossible workloads on my desk, smirking when I stayed long past midnight while he left early for dinners at five-star restaurants. In board meetings, he stole credit for my presentations, casually sliding my work into his folders, never once mentioning my name. When projects succeeded, he was the hero. When they failed, I was the scapegoat. And he never missed a chance to humiliate me. "Rookie," he'd say with a laugh, tossing files onto my desk. Or worse, the invisible man. The whole office would laugh nervously, not at the joke, but at the fear of not laughing. That was Edward's power, commanding fear, not respect. But what Edward didn't realize was that I was watching. I wasn't just doing the work he dumped on me. I was observing him. The arrogance in the way he dismissed warnings, the recklessness in his decisions, the shortcuts he proudly took to impress his father. While he strutted, I listened. While he shouted, I studied. And slowly, a picture began to form. Edward Sterling Jr. wasn't just arrogant. He was careless. He believed his last name could shield him from consequences. He believed he was untouchable. But arrogance has cracks. And cracks, when you look closely enough, always lead to collapse. On that very first week, as I packed up my files at midnight and looked through the glass wall at Edward's corner office, still glowing with empty pride, I made a quiet promise to myself. I wouldn't fight him. I wouldn't try to outshine him. I wouldn't even raise my voice. I'd do something far more powerful. I would wait. And in time, I would let Edward Sterling Jr. destroy himself. Edward Sterling Jr. had a gift, but not the kind that inspires admiration. His gift was the ability to charm people into believing lies. He didn't just exaggerate. He fabricated entire realities and presented them with the confidence of a man who had never heard the word no in his life. The office learned quickly that Edward had no interest in long-term stability or careful planning. What he craved were quick wins, flashy numbers, and headlines that would make his father beam with pride. For Edward, every deal was a stage, every client a captive audience, and every presentation his personal spotlight. The first time I truly saw his arrogance in action was during the preparation for a high-profile client. The Dempsey Group, a billion-dollar real estate investment firm. They were cautious, meticulous, and known for pulling out of deals at the faintest whiff of risk. But to Edward, this was an opportunity to prove that he could seduce even the toughest skeptics. He assigned me the groundwork. Weeks of research, sleepless nights, spreadsheets layered with data, and risk assessments so detailed they could predict a storm before the first cloud formed. I poured everything into that analysis, determined to give Sterling & Company a clear picture of what lay ahead. But the night before the big pitch, Edward appeared at my cubicle. His silk tie loosened, a tumbler of whiskey in hand. He waved my reports like they were useless drafts. "Too negative," he scoffed. "Clients don't pay us to scare them. They pay us to dream big. And right now you're selling nightmares." I tried to explain, the market volatility, the shaky interest rates, the zoning complications that could sink the project, but Edward wasn't listening. He leaned in. his smirk sharp enough to cut glass. "We're not in the business of truth, rookie. We're in the business of confidence. Let me worry about the details. You just make sure the slides look pretty." I nodded, outwardly obedient. Inwardly, I saved every version of my reports, every warning I had written, every risk he chose to ignore. The next morning, Edward strutted into the conference room like a conquering hero. He spoke with booming authority, flashing bold charts and colorful projections. He promised returns that sounded too good to be true, because they were. The Dempsey Group listened, skeptical at first, but Edward's charisma was relentless. He dazzled them with visions of profit, dismissed concerns with a wave of his hand, and ended his pitch with a smile so confident it bordered on arrogance. The clients applauded. Edward bowed his head slightly, soaking in the glory. His father, seated at the end of the table, called him a born leader. And me? I clapped along with everyone else. But inside, I knew something Edward didn't. He had just locked himself into a promise built on sand. He had stripped away the caution, silenced the truth, and replaced it with illusions. The clients might have been convinced that morning. But reality? Reality was waiting, and it never forgets. The Dempsey deal went through faster than anyone expected. Edward's father praised him in front of the board, calling it visionary leadership. Edward soaked it all in, strutting around the office like a peacock, his smirk wider than ever. He ordered champagne, gave speeches about how sterling blood always delivers, and even hinted that one day he'd take over the entire company. But arrogance has a way of blinding men. While Edward basked in applause, I saw the storm on the horizon. It started small numbers on quarterly reports that didn't align with Edward's glossy projections. Construction costs began rising due to supply chain issues. Interest rates crept upward, tightening the real estate market. And worst of all, zoning restrictions, the very ones I had flagged, suddenly halted part of the Dempsey project. Within weeks, the flawless dream Edward had sold began to look like a nightmare. But Edward refused to admit it. Instead, he doubled down. One afternoon, he stormed into my cubicle, red-faced and sweating. He slammed a folder on my desk. "Fix this," he barked. "The numbers don't look right. Make them better." I looked at the spreadsheets. They were a disaster. Costs ballooning, revenue projections shrinking, timelines slipping. Better wasn't possible. Not unless better meant lies. I hesitated. "Sir, these are the real numbers. Adjusting them won't." "Did I ask for a lecture?" he snapped, cutting me off. "You work for me. You'll make these numbers shine, or you'll regret it." The arrogance in his tone was unmistakable, but beneath it, I caught something new, fear. So, I did exactly what he asked. I polished the numbers, dressed them in graphs, and handed him projections that looked neat and clean but hid the raging fire beneath. He didn't even glance at the details. He slapped me on the back and said, "Good man. This is what leadership looks like." But I didn't stop there. Quietly, I archived every draft, every email, every fix this instruction. I was no longer just surviving under Edward. I was building a file, a silent record of his arrogance in action. As the weeks rolled on, the whispers began. The board members asked questions in hushed voices. The CFO raised an eyebrow at the inconsistencies. The Dempsey Group, once dazzled by Edward's confidence, began demanding updates, their tone colder with each call. And Edward? He unraveled. He shouted at assistants, berated colleagues, and turned every setback into a blame game. His once flawless charm now cracked under pressure. But the most dangerous thing was how careless he became. He left trails of lies in emails. He signed off on reports without reading them. He barked orders in public, where anyone could overhear. The cracks weren't just appearing in the deal. They were appearing in Edward himself. And while everyone else panicked, I remained silent. Patient. Because I knew the truth. Edward Sterling Jr. was no longer climbing higher. He was falling. And the only question left was how far he'd go before he hit the ground. By the next quarter, the tension in Sterling and Company was thick enough to choke on. The glow of Edward's visionary deal had started to fade, replaced by unease that rippled through every corridor. The whispers weren't whispers anymore. They were conversations behind half-closed doors, raised eyebrows in meetings, subtle glances toward me whenever numbers didn't add up. The quarterly board meeting was the breaking point. Edward swaggered into the room with his usual confidence, carrying slides filled with colorful projections and optimistic forecasts. He greeted the executives like an actor greeting his audience. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice smooth, "I'm pleased to report that our Dempsey project is well ahead of schedule, and profits are tracking above expectations." The room nodded politely, but something was different. The CFO, a sharp-eyed woman named Ms. Harris, leaned forward and interrupted. "Edward, these projections, they don't align with the market reports we've been receiving. Can you explain the discrepancy?" The words hit Edward like ice water. For the first time, his smirk faltered. He cleared his throat, shuffled a paper, then turned his gaze to me. "My analyst can explain," he said, gesturing toward me like I was his shield. Dozens of eyes turned. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. I could have exposed him right then, laid out every risk he had ignored, every number he had ordered me to polish. But I didn't. Instead, I kept my tone neutral, calm, professional. The projections reflect optimistic market conditions, while the external reports highlight potential risks. Both perspectives exist. It depends on which assumptions you choose to emphasize. It was an answer that said everything and nothing at the same time. The board members frowned, unsatisfied, but Edward seized the lifeline. He clapped his hands together and said, "Exactly. Optimism is what drives growth. Thank you." The meeting moved on, but the damage was done. Doubt now hung in the room like smoke. Afterward, Edward cornered me in the hallway, his face twisted with anger. "You work for me," he hissed. "If I go down, you go down. Don't forget that." I looked at him, calm as ever. "Of course, sir," I replied. What Edward didn't realize was that I wasn't his shield. I wasn't even his enemy. I was his witness. Every order, every directive, every falsified number, I had it all neatly stored. Emails, drafts, messages. The truth wasn't a weapon I needed to swing. It was a time bomb, and Edward himself was the one lighting the fuse. That night, as the office emptied and Edward retreated to his penthouse, I sat alone at my desk, reviewing the growing folder of evidence. My colleagues were starting to see cracks, the board was beginning to ask questions, and Edward still thought he was untouchable. But the walls were closing in. And when they did, I wouldn't need to push him. I'd simply stand back and watch him collapse. The storm finally arrived on a gray Monday morning. I walked into the office to find Edward pacing his glass-walled corner like a caged animal, his phone glued to his ear. His voice thundered through the walls, but the panic in his tone was impossible to hide. The Dempsey Group had called. They weren't impressed anymore. They were furious. The zoning delays had cost them millions, supply chain issues were bleeding the project dry, and the rosy forecasts Edward had sold them now looked like pure fantasy. They demanded answers. Real answers. By noon, Edward called an emergency meeting with his team. He slammed his fist against the table. "Listen up," he barked, sweat glistening at his temple. "We've got until Friday to submit a full transparency report. No excuses, no delays. The client wants it on their desk, real numbers, every detail." The room fell silent. His eyes darted toward me. "You'll fix this for me," he snarled. "You'll make it clean. You'll make it perfect. Or you'll never work in this industry again." I stared at him calmly. He thought fear would move me. He thought threats would bend me. But all it did was confirm what I already knew. Edward Sterling Jr. was unraveling. "Of course, sir," I replied smoothly. And so, for the next 4 days, I worked tirelessly, but not in the way Edward imagined. I didn't bury the truth. I didn't fix the numbers into a fantasy. Instead, I prepared 2 reports. The first was Edward's version. Polished, glowing, full of optimism. The kind of report he wanted, the kind of lie he had built his empire on. The second was the truth. Raw, unfiltered, damning. Every red flag I had documented from the beginning. Every risk he had dismissed. Every false projection he had sold. And attached to it all were the receipts. Emails, drafts, directives. His fingerprints on every lie. By Friday, Edward was a wreck. His suit was wrinkled, his voice hoarse from shouting, his confidence cracked beyond repair. Yet when he stepped into the boardroom, he put on the same arrogant mask he always wore. He presented the polished version, smiling wide, his voice booming with false assurance. For a moment, I almost admired his commitment to the lie. Almost. But this time, things were different. The board had questions. Specific ones. Numbers that didn't align. Projections that contradicted external reports. And then the CEO, Edward's own father, spoke. Edward, we've received some additional documents from compliance. They don't match your report. Care to explain? The silence that followed was deafening. Edward froze, his face draining of color. He shuffled his papers, stammered, tried to redirect blame, but it was too late. The truth had walked into the room, and it had his name written all over it. The boardroom fell into stunned silence. For the first time in his career, Edward Sterling Jr. didn't have a clever line or a charming smile to hide behind. His lips trembled as his father slid the compliance packet across the table. These documents, the CEO said, voice calm but heavy, paint a very different picture than the one you've presented. Edward's eyes dotted wildly, searching for an escape. And then he found me. This is sabotage, he shouted, pointing a trembling finger in my direction. He, my analyst, he's the one behind this. He's been feeding you lies, twisting numbers, trying to ruin me. Dozens of eyes turned toward me. For a heartbeat, the room was frozen in tension. I could feel Edward's desperation clawing at me, his need to shift the blame onto anyone but himself. I didn't flinch. Calmly, I opened my laptop and connected it to the screen. With the board's permission, I said, my voice steady, I'd like to walk through the data trail. A nod from the CFO was all I needed. Slide after slide appeared, emails signed by Edward, directives where he demanded numbers be made better, drafts he rejected because they included risk assessments, and finalized reports where his edits turned warnings into promises. Every lie, every shortcut, every reckless command. His fingerprints were everywhere. The boardroom grew colder with each slide. Edward's protests grew weaker. They're out of context, he cried. Those are drafts, not final reports. But the timestamps told a different story. The signatures, the approvals, the messages in his own arrogant tone, there was no escape. Finally, Ms. Harris, the CFO, closed her folder with a sharp snap. Edward, this isn't sabotage. This is negligence. You ignored every warning. You misled clients. And you put this company at risk. The CEO, his father, looked at him with something worse than anger. Disappointment. You've embarrassed this firm. And you've embarrassed me. Edward's face twisted. He pounded his fist on the table, his arrogance collapsing into raw fury. This company is nothing without me, he roared. I built this deal. I carried the weight. And you're all turning against me because of some petty analyst. But his words fell flat. No one believed him anymore. In that moment, I realized something. Edward wasn't just falling. He was imploding, dragging every ounce of his pride down with him. And all I had done was stand quietly, documenting the truth. The chairman cleared his throat. Effective immediately, Edward Sterling Jr. is suspended pending a full investigation. Gasps rippled through the room. Edward's face turned ashen. He tried to speak, but no words came. As security escorted him out, his eyes locked on mine. Rage. Betrayal. Fear. And behind it all, the faint realization that he hadn't been destroyed by me. He had destroyed himself. The news of Edward's suspension spread through the office like wildfire. Hallways that once echoed with his booming arrogance now buzzed with disbelief. Some whispered with satisfaction. After all, he had made enemies everywhere he went. Others shook their heads, stunned that the CEO's son had finally been knocked from his pedestal. As for Edward himself, he vanished. His name was quietly scrubbed from internal memos, his office locked, his title stripped from the company website. The man who once strutted like royalty was suddenly reduced to a ghost story whispered at the coffee machine. The board moved swiftly. An internal investigation confirmed what I had already known. Edward had ignored risk assessments, manipulated numbers, and gambled recklessly with the company's reputation. The Dempsey Group pulled their funding, demanding compensation. Sterling and Company absorbed a financial hit, but in the long run, it was Edward's career that paid the ultimate price. And then came the day the CEO, his father, addressed the entire company. We gathered in the grand hall, waiting in tense silence. The old man walked to the podium, his face grim but steady. "Integrity," he said, his voice echoing. "That is the foundation of this firm. And no one, not even family, is above it." The room erupted in applause, not because of the words themselves, but because of what they meant. Edward Sterling Jr. was finished. I stood in the back, hands clasped, face unreadable. No one clapped harder than me. Weeks passed, and life at Sterling and Company settled into a new rhythm. But one afternoon, I was called into a boardroom, not for punishment, but for recognition. The senior partners praised my diligence, my professionalism, my calm under pressure. They said that while Edward had been loud and reckless, I had been steady and reliable. They wanted me to step into a new role, one with more responsibility and more authority. It wasn't a grand promotion story. I wasn't hailed as a hero. There were no champagne toasts or spotlights. Instead, it was quiet, respectful. The kind of recognition built on trust, not theatrics. One partner, Ms. Harris, lingered after the meeting. She looked at me with a knowing smile. "You didn't push him," she said softly. "You didn't need to. Sometimes the best revenge is patience. Arrogance destroys itself if you let it." Her words stayed with me. I never set out to ruin Edward. I didn't plot or manipulate. I didn't have to. He built his empire on sand, and all I did was stand steady when the tide came in. Looking back, I realize that's the true lesson of it all. Revenge doesn't always require action. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is wait. Because arrogance? It always collapses. And Edward Sterling Jr., my arrogant boss, was proof of that.